Ladies and gentlemen, and those of you in the corridors that would like to join the plenary, could you please move forward and try to find your seats so that we can start going. As always, you know, the time is going to run out, and we don't want to steal too much of the time from the upcoming plenary either. Then firstly, a word of warning. I'm economist by education. I'm ecologist by heart, and I'm a politician in everyday life. So whatever you take as good or bad, but let's say that I know the virtues but the vices also about the profession of economists and the education of economists. And let me start with the fact why I got a bit frustrated ages ago when I studied it. Economics is not physics. It's not mathematics. And it's not natural science where 1 + 1 can only and always be 2, and where if you prefer A to B, you always prefer A to C. And this is what the whole profession, right, actually is trying to do. Wannabe natural science. This is the truth. But, well, it's their problem. But what is our problem is that all the politicians are taking it like a natural science. They listen, the economists, the ministers of the finance and economics. What is the GDP? Are we growing? How much debt do we have? Oh gosh, now we need to save. Now we can't spend. And blissfully unaware of millions of things. Just to mention how this kind of a gendered worldview reflects on economics. It's always the puppy that comes with the money to house, and it's mama that spends the money, right? Look the amount of guys in trade, agriculture, finance, and the women in education ministries, social and environment. Have you noticed that always when you put the money on cement, iron and asphalt, no matter what, it's an investment. And you never talk about care economy. You need to care the roads, and that the roads are expenditure because they cost so much. But guess what happens when you educate people and you take care of ill people and people with mental stress and try to patch them? It is expenditure that we cannot afford if the GDP doesn't go up and so forth. So actually the whole information and analytics is going in dreadfully wrong direction. And we know it, and still we don't know how to act and what to do. And another small example, going to nature. You know, discounting system, how you can sort of predict future values, let's say, for example, in investments, with the formula having this today's value to be seen in the future. And always oil and coal that has been very profitable in the future. It's the past performance. Gives high figures. So it's a good investment. But what about solar power, wind? A lot of sustainable investments who do not have the track record. Risky business. Oil. No. You know it's profitable. And this actually encourages the oil and fossil companies to go on after new wells and reservations, even though they might be thinking they can't even open them, because it adds they value the assets on the balance sheet. And it's just a formula done by someone and used by many. And so, what are we doing today? We are dwelling in economics. It's economics stupid, as said. And this time the mirror is showing to us, economists, what is the power of economic models on decision making and society at large? Whom do we listen? Who counts what counts? And what would we need to do together to change the models? Man-made, woman-changed. And how, indeed, because I do believe in economics, this approximation of the economy could actually serve us as human beings and societies. So, wholeheartedly welcome. Please join now. Please join with your comments and questions, and keep on coming together with us in this network also in the future. Then, to start with, we do not have on place Paulo Gentiloni, who is the European Commissioner for Economy, and actually could have had very good intervention and maybe comments on this. But while he couldn't be present, he has a video recording for us. And then after that, we directly moved to Pettifor. Very happy to have you with us and to hear your intervention. Please, the Gentiloni.
Dear Chair, honourable members, distinguished guests, let me first thank the organisers for this cross-party initiative. Keynes once wrote that the ideas of economists and political philosophers are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, he wrote, the world is ruled by little else. So this session on the power of economic models is definitely appropriate. I think we can all agree that an economy based on an ever-increasing use of limited resources that produces even more waste and emissions is not a sustainable model. Nor can a model that perpetuates inequalities be viable in the long run. Understandably, in recent years, dissatisfaction with an economic system that increases disparities and threatens our planet has grown. And this discontent also extends to the way we measure progress or growth, notably GDP. We all recognize that GDP as an indicator has its limits. Indeed, in the first article I published as Commissioner, even before the pandemic hit, I called for a new sustainable growth strategy and for integrating a broader set of indicators into our assessment of how member states are performing. But I want to be clear that the alternative to a traditional growth model cannot be a degrowth model. A shrinking economy will have fewer, not more, resources to invest in environmental protection, in healthcare, education, infrastructure, and the likes. Economic growth remains an essential engine for positive change. That is why the shift in paradigm that the Commission has embraced is towards sustainable growth, that does not come at the expense of the environment, nor at the expense of the weakest in our societies. This paradigm shift is what the European Green Deal is all about. It's about transforming the European economy and moving to a different growth model, one powered by carbon-free electricity and renewables, and based on circularity principles, reuse and recycling. It's about lifting our growth and making sure that the fruits of that growth are shared more widely, also by investing in new and more advanced skills. Our approach to sustainable growth is a holistic one. For example, the European semester, our cycle of economic policy coordination, focuses on the economic, environmental and social dimensions of sustainability. This same approach has guided our economic response to the pandemic and to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, first with Next Generation EU and then with Repower EU. And there is widespread support for it. Over 80% of citizens agree that the EU should invest massively in renewable energies and increasing the energy efficiency of buildings, transport and goods, according to the latest EU Barometer survey. At the same time, many citizens are concerned about the cost of the transition, a worry compounded by high inflation and record energy prices in the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion last year. And this is where evidence-based policy design comes in. The Commission uses a range of economic models to assess and compare policy options and their distributional effects. Our models look at the impact of regulations and emissions pricing and the benefits of using the revenues to ease the social impact of the transition or boost green technology. But further efforts are needed to be able to quantify the impacts of economic activity on all natural assets and the consequences of their degradation for the economic possibilities of our children and grandchildren. At EU level, there has been a lot of progress in this field. For instance, Eurostat has developed several new indicators that measure what matters, such as CO2 emissions and income inequality. Every year, Eurostat publishes a report on how each member state is performing on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Commission has been working on integrating these new indicators, as well as the SDGs, into the European semester. And this July, the EU will, for the first time, present a voluntary review on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda at the high-level political forum in New York. Ladies and gentlemen, building an economy that works for the people and the planet is a formidable challenge, but one we cannot shy away from. Integrated environmental and economic models can guide us in this difficult task, and the regular dialogue with all the stakeholders involved is essential. So I am confident that together we can successfully shift to a new model of growth that is both sustained and sustainable, and show that economic growth can, indeed, must be a force for good. Thank you.
Okay. Here we heard the message by our Commissioner for Economy. And what do you think? Shall we raise the bar? And it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Pettifor, Director of Prime Policy Research in Macroeconomics. Please, the floor is yours.
So I want to begin, as everybody has, by thanking Philippe Lamberts and his team and the 20 MEPs that have made this possible. We're so impressed by the level of the organisation and the care that you've taken over this. But I also want to say, and this is probably not as popular, that I want to say thank you to President Ursula von der Leyen for the generosity of her hosting this event, of the Commission hosting this event. I've only heard criticisms of her speech, but I thought her speech was an incredibly important one. And we on the green side of the political spectrum need to be careful. We don't have enough friends, right? That's our problem. That's what we have to fix. So we shouldn't, alienate those people that are coming towards us. Right, so we've spent these days basking, thank you. We've spent these days basking in consensus. We all agree on the need for sufficiency, not efficiency, on equity, especially for the South, on well-being, on regenerative economy, a donut economy, a circular economy. We've agreed on all of that. We feel very happy with ourselves because we're all cheering each other on, right? But there has been no discussion of a strategy for challenging power. So there are two sites of power that should concern us. The first one is the fossil interest, and that's a site that we're already at. We're at the barricades in front of the fossil interest, and we're throwing stones at them, we're shouting at them, we're booing at them, right? But there is another site of power, and that is the money interest, and we are nowhere near it. So they have erected barricades against us. They have protected themselves from any democratic accountability, from democratic regulatory oversight. They are now behind the barriers, and we are not even challenging them. We're not even where the real power is. And they have something which is extraordinary. It's like a giant tap. It's like a giant spigot or a gas pump at a petrol station. And that pumps out easy, deregulated money, and most of it is aimed at the fossil interest. So we need to switch off that big spigot, that enormous pump. We have to switch it off because it's easy money, which means it's deregulated credit, and it's out of control. It is the thing that is fueling fossil fuel investment and greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, we need to focus on monetary policy, not fall into the trap set by the money interest, who want us to focus exclusively on fiscal policy. We need to challenge the power of the money interest. We need to understand the global economic model that they operate. We call it capitalism without brakes, powered by infinite supplies of easy money, of credit. But there's another aspect to that model, which is that it's export-oriented. All of our economies in Europe are oriented towards the global economy, towards exports. And the domestic economy at home is neglected. Now, who's engaged in the export sector? The 1%, the big corporations. The model of our economies is to do everything to suit their interests, right? So what it does is to boost the income of the 1%, that model, but at the same time, simultaneously, it depresses the wages, the incomes of the 99%. Now, the rich don't spend all their money. Elon Musk, you know, can buy the odd rocket to go into outer space, but really, he doesn't know what to do with all his money, and he doesn't spend it. He doesn't use it to buy the things the economy produces. The poor, the 99%, spend all of their income, but in fact, their income is shrinking. And you can see they struggle to pay for a roof over their heads, to pay for decent health, to pay for dentistry in my country, right? To pay for their kids to go to university. All of these things are now becoming beyond their reach. They can't purchase all that the economy produces. So then we have this extraordinary thing where they don't use their purchasing power to produce what is to buy what is produced. The result is the opposite of what much green commentary is about. It's a crisis of overproduction on the one hand and underconsumption on the other. And I want to say this, so far from purchasing power chasing too few goods and services, which is what the mainstream would have us think, we have too many goods and services chasing too little purchasing power. And you can see it on any high street when those pound shops come and you see all of those Chinese goods dumped in shops. We have gluts, we have surpluses. We're producing too much, and this, of course, has a massive ecological impact. But when the Green Movement, we tend to focus on consumption. And we tend to focus, in particular, on the consumption of the 99%. And we leave alone the 1%. I want us to change that focus. So the thing is that when people cannot afford to maintain their living standards, to pay for a roof over their heads, to pay for education or whatever, what do? They borrow money. And when firms can't meet their sales targets, what do? They borrow money too. And so we have this crisis of overproduction, huge amounts of debt, and easy money, right? And low incomes, falling real incomes. Across the board, in the United States, in Europe, in China. China's repressing incomes in exactly the same way as the Germans have been doing since the Hartz reforms, right? So this place, we know that this mixture of overproduction, debt, and falling incomes leads to global financial crises. So the question now becomes, when is the next one? That's all. And if you can get the timing right, you can make a lot of money. I'm never good at getting the timing right. So, what lesson does this provide for the Green Movement? We must stop attacking the 99%, if you like, the majority, the people who are actually suffering under this model, this economic model. They're turning to the far right, because as Polanyi argued, you know, what they can see is that the market is stripping them of all that's important to them, and so they're looking, and they've been told that, the government can't do anything, because the market says that they must pay for this and they must pay for that, and that the price is up and so on. The market decides the price of grain. The market decides, the invisible hand of the market decides the price of oil. And if the market fancies speculating on the price of oil, it so does, and it makes us pay, right? And what happens is the 99% say, we want to be protected from this market, and they turn to a strong man. It's invariably a strong man. In Italy, it's a strong woman. Please protect us from these markets. What is the left saying? What is the progressive side of the spectrum saying? What they're saying is, this is the model. So we must stop attacking the 99%. We must attack the 1% for excess production by way of excess easy money. As Philip said last night at our gathering, this is a fight. This is a struggle. This is war. And the challenge we face is this. How do we mobilize the 99% to fight this war? To break down the barricades erected by the 1%? That's what I want to discuss, instead of everything that we agree on. And the first step, in my mind, we can take is this. shine a very bright light on the finance sector, on the 1%. Secondly, educate ourselves. This is not rocket science. I can tell you, if I understand it, you'll understand it, right? Thirdly, understand that the 1% is represented by Wall Street, Frankfurt, and the City of London, and that they would be nowhere without the taxpayer-backed public infrastructure which supports their money-making, their speculation, their capital gains, right? They need the central bank, and the central bank is only there because behind it are millions. I don't know how many million taxpayers there are in Europe. There's only 30 million in Britain. But without 30 million taxpayers paying their taxes every year, every month, every day, there wouldn't be the revenues that the finance sector gets from the bonds that it buys as collateral, right? This is public infrastructure. This is our money. This is our power. We have to recognize that this is our power. We have to recognize that government bonds, the debt, which, you know, the right would have us believe is some kind of evil thing, is actually something that the finance sector cannot wait to get its hands on. There was a crisis under the Clinton administration when Clinton decided he was going to have a budget surplus. That led to a shortage of bonds on Wall Street. And the private Wall Street nearly collapsed under the strain because it needs that collateral to be the collateral it gets to leverage additional money in the shadow banking sector beyond democratic regulation. So we need to understand that we have power, and we have to take that power and we have to use it to dismantle the power exercised by the 1%. We need to acknowledge and deploy the power that is embedded in our public tax-funded institutions. We need to mobilize public opinion and build political power. I'm not impressed with booing politicians who are here because they're elected to represent our communities, our societies, and our governments. They're doing their job, right? We have to mobilize those people so that we get different politicians. And if we've got the wrong politicians, that's our problem. We've got to address it. Finally, the thing we just absolutely have to do is to blow up the easy money pipeline. Thank you.
Well, Anne, you certainly blew it up and gave the whole audience a really strong spirit. So thank you for that. Next, we will have Gail Giro, Professor Director of Research from CNRS. And again, he's from the video. So Giraud, welcome, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to thank as well Philippe Lamberts for this marvelous event and Anne Pettifor for a very inspiring speech. So I don't know whether you can see my slides.
Yes, we do.
Okay, can you see them? Yeah, okay, good. So next slide. I'm going to try first, in the first part, very quickly to explain to you how some models lead to wrong policies. This will be a little bit technical, but please bear with me. Second part, and it's a little bit more subtle. Wait a minute, or first slide, the slide before. Second part, I will try to explain how some assumptions, in a very subtle way, already encapsulate, at least implicitly, some policies. So we are prisoners of these assumptions, and therefore we are prisoners of these policies. And if we don't change the assumptions themselves, we won't be able to change the policies. And I will go back to how to blow up the easy money pipeline that Anne Pettifor just described. And third part, I will try to show you that there exist alternative models. They are not perfect, because there is no such thing as a perfect model, but they are much better than the mainstream models that are used by almost everybody on this planet today. Next slide. So first of all, in 2016, there was a big crisis within the profession of macroeconomists, where you had some people like Paul Romer, who back then was the chief economist of the World Bank, and who would receive his Nobel Award just a few years later, who wrote a paper just saying, macroeconomic theory is no longer in science. Next slide. Then you had also a paper by Olivia Blanchard. He was then the chief economist of the IMF, and he said essentially, the assumptions that we use in our models are essentially profoundly at odds with everything we know about reality. The way we calibrate our model is non-convincing. The normative implications of our model are not convincing, and our DSG model, which back then was the kind of, the top of the frontier of the research in macroeconomics, our DSG models are completely flawed. Next slide. So here is an illustration of how this works. You have the black curve is the GDP of Greece just before the big crisis of the Greek debt, public debt. And the curves around the trajectory are the forecast of the Troika, that is of the IMF, the European Commission, and the ECB. And as you can see, each year, the Troika was deeply wrong, just anticipating that the Greek GDP would go back to its previous value. And each year, the ECB and the European Commission and the IMF could not even learn from its past mistakes. Why? Because they use models which are at equilibrium. And so if you use an equilibrium model, of course you will say, well, there is a small problem, it's a small extraordinary shock. But don't worry, the Greek GDP will go back to its previous value, which is supposedly, allegedly, its equilibrium value. And the consequence of that is that after that, of course, you can impose a very harsh austerity program, because you believe that no matter what, the Greek GDP will go back to its equilibrium value. What is completely wrong here is the very idea that our economy is at equilibrium. The truth is that it's not, and that we need out-of-equilibrium models. Next slide. Here is another example of big mistakes that we make when we try to forecast. So the rate curve is the price of oil at the world level, which is probably the most important commodity today in the world economy. And the colored lines are the forecasts of the International Energy Agency in Paris. And as you can see, again, each year, the IEA is deeply wrong in its forecast. Why? Because most often, the IEA just expects that the price of oil will follow the linear extension of its past. And so what we see here is that not only are our economies not at equilibrium, but the dynamics of our economy is not linear, even in the short run. We cannot just expect that tomorrow will be the linear extension of yesterday. We have to think about the non-linear dynamics of our economies. Next slide. Here is another example which is also very, very troublesome. The rate curve is the level of inflation, the CPI for the US, during and after the global financial crisis of 2007. And the blue curve is the quantity of money created by the Federal Reserve. So that's the pipeline of easy money that Anne Pettifor was alluding to earlier. And as you can see, you have the different phases of the quantitative easing period number 1, then QE2, then QE3, meaning that the central bank in the US has created billions and billions of money just to save the banks. And then many people would argue that this would have led to a huge inflation, and the rate curve is just a level of prices, showing that there was no inflation at all. So the mantra of a number of models which says that if you just print money, this will create inflation is just wrong. We have a counterexample here. And if this is wrong, this means that we have to change completely our models, because 99.9% of the models used by big institutions like the IMF, the ECB, the World Bank, etc., just assume that if you increase the quantity of money circulating in the economy, you will just have inflation. And we know this is just not true. This means that we need models that can incorporate the true impact of printing money. Next slide. Here is another example, which is the rate curve is the public debt of the US before, during, and after the great financial crisis, the global financial crisis. As you see, obviously, the US debt has increased tremendously, and yet the blue curve is the spread that is a measure of the riskiness of the public debt of the US assessed by financial markets. And as you may know, and this was alluded to by Anne Pettifor earlier, the bonds, the treasury bonds, are used as collaterals pretty much everywhere within the financial sphere. So the price of US treasury bonds is absolutely key for the entire planet. And as you can see, the riskiness of the public debt, as it has been assessed by financial markets, has shrunk, has reduced during the same period. Instead of saying, oh, the public debt is increasing, therefore it's more dangerous to purchase public debt in the US, the financial markets have said, oh, no, the situation is very risky, so let's go back to what is secure, which is US treasury bonds. And so our models, when they claim that more public debt means more riskiness, means a higher interest rate, for instance, paid by the state, they are just wrong. Next slide. So now going back to climate, when we try as economists to couple macroeconomics and climate, then we have to face a big problem, which is how to assess the impact of global warming. And for that purpose, we use what is called the damage function. Probably the most famous damage function is the one introduced by Bill Nordhaus, who got the Nobel Award, and it's the blue curve here in this graph. So the x-axis is the increase of temperature, and the y-axis is the fraction of the world GDP that would be lost if we were to experience this increase of temperature. According to Bill Nordhaus' damage function, if we had an increase of global warming, let's say at the end of the century, of plus 6 degrees Celsius, then we would experience only a loss of 10% of the world real GDP, which honestly is completely ludicrous. And yet you have many people, many economists and many also politicians following Bill Nordhaus and saying, well, global warming is not that dangerous because it will lead at most to minus 10% of the world GDP, which is not, the end of history. Fortunately, there are alternatives, the one by Weizmann and the one by Dietz and Stern, which claim respectively that plus 6 degrees will lead to minus 50% of the world GDP and the other one minus 90%. And of course, whether you believe that Dietz and Stern are right or Nordhaus is right, you will end up with completely different conclusions, and you will, of course, advise for completely different public policies. Next slide. Another point which is also absolutely key is why did we economists not understand the key role played by energy in our economy? If we have a power blackout like in India or in Texas or in California, then of course the entire economy is completely stopped. But this you will never see in a model, in an economic mainstream model. Why? Because most of these models are built on the assumption that the role played by the energy in our economy can be assessed, can be measured thanks to the cost of energy in GDP. This is the so-called cost-share theorem. And this cost turns out to be low as long as the price of energy is low. For instance, in the US, it has only been something like 8% of the US GDP during a long period of time. And therefore, many economists would argue during this period that, well, energy, is not a big deal because it costs only 8% of the GDP. And therefore, if we lose it, it's not a big deal, which of course is completely wrong. So we have to understand the key role played by energy and of course by fossil fuels in the dynamics of our economy if we want just to be able to think about the transition towards renewable energies. Next slide. And the last point I want to mention immediately is the so-called uncovered rate parity, which is a famous theory used by mainstream models to try to understand the dynamics of exchange rates. And here what you see, it's a bit fuzzy, it's a bit chaotic, it's the distance with respect to what theory would forecast, and the distance between what the theory would forecast and what you empirically observe. And as you see, there is a big distance, whatever being the kind of currency that you're looking at. In other words, we have no way today within our mainstream economic models to understand the dynamics of exchange rates. And then this raises a big question. Why do we have flexible exchange rates if we don't understand how they move? Next slide. Another point also very important is the role of money. And this goes back to Anne's pipeline of easy money. In most mainstream models, there is simply no money. Why? Because money is assumed to be neutral in the sense that if you just multiply by 2 the quantity of money circulating in the economy, you just multiply by 2 the level of prices, according to these models. And of course, this is completely wrong. It's not true. Empirically speaking, we know that money is non-neutral. On top of that, in most of these models, there is no bank. Why? Because most of these models, like the Diamond-Dybvig model, they simply assume that a bank is only a financial intermediary entity, which borrows from the left hand the money that it lends from the right hand. Of course, this is not true. In real life, every day a bank creates money, ex nihilo. That's the job of a bank, a private bank. And so if we don't understand this, of course we cannot understand the role to finance the ecological transition, and we cannot understand how the fragility of our banks just threaten today our entire economy. Next slide. So in reality, money is neutral. The money creation is endogenous, and money creation is not necessarily inflationary. And what is behind all this is the main idea that in most of these mainstream models, saving leads to to investment. And that's why most of these models would say we have to take care of the capitalists or the wealthy people because they are saving money. And this money that is saved by them is used in order to finance investment. This is again completely wrong. We know today that it's exactly the opposite. Investment finance savings. In other words, it's because there is a demand for commodities, for services, and therefore because there are entrepreneurs who borrow money in order to finance investment, that wealthy people can save money, not the other way. And as long as we have the idea to postulate the axiom that savings leads to investment, this will lead to completely wrong public policies, which will systematically favor the saviors. I mean, those who can save money, that is actually who are benefiting from the work that we are doing, the investment that we are doing, our labor and our efforts. So, and we will, the 99%, we will be completely neglected. Next slide. So, for instance, the excellent Rousseau Institute, which is a French think tank, published a report 2 years ago showing that if you scrutinize the first 11 commercial banks of the Eurozone, you will see that they have on the balance sheet a number of fossil fuel assets, which represent on average 95% of their equity. In other words, if tomorrow morning we were to be very bold and we decided that fossil fuels are stranded assets, then all of these banks would be bankrupt. And therefore, they can threaten today politicians by saying, oh, you want to go too fast in the direction of the ecological transition. If you do that, we are going to go bankrupt and you will have to save us. And we all know that most states just cannot save big, mega systemic banks. And therefore, that's one of the reasons, and I believe that's the main reason, why we go so slowly in the direction of the transition, of the ecological transition, that we need to put into practice. And therefore, if we want to win the war that Anne was alluding to, we definitely need to find a way to get rid of the fossil fuel assets which are on the balance sheet of the banks. Next slide. So I will go directly to the next slide because time is running. Second part, it's more subtle, so I will go very fast. Next slide. There is an academic debate about the Shortrun Phillips curve. This Phillips curve says that the increase of pay of wages is a function of unemployment. If there is a lot of unemployment, it's much easier for employers to refuse to increase wages because they will tell you, well, you know, if you are unhappy with your payroll today, I mean, there are many people who want to take your job. And so for almost 30 years today, there is a big academic battle against the short-run Phillips curves, where you have a number of macroeconomists claiming that it simply does not exist. In reality, if you scrutinize the data, you will see that it exists. And the reason I believe that we have this debate, it's because it's a way to hide the fact that we have made the choice of unemployment 30 years ago in Europe. By saying that inflation was the big enemy, we have implicitly said we want to favor unemployment. But in order for this not to be completely obvious, at the same time we also said, oh, you know, there is no relationship between wages, inflation, and unemployment. This is just, you know, an old fairy tale from the Keynesians in the whole time. It does no longer exist today. And in reality, we have made a choice of unemployment, which is a very bad public policy choice, but we have hidden it behind wrong theory and behind wrong models. Next slide. Another point also is inequality, of course. So this is a very famous curve, you know, it's the elephant curve. So I will go back immediately to the next slide, which is Branko-Milanovic very famous curve, which tells you that if you look at the growth of wealth in the past 20 or 25 years or so, essentially those who are at the trunk of the elephant, that is the far right, the 1%, they have benefited a lot. But also, you know, some people would say, well, you know, look at the head of the elephant, and so it's not so bad for the middle class, it's not so bad also for the poor. So this was essentially the message conveyed by Branko-Milanovic. Now, it happens that there is a bunch of other economists, next slide, who have redone the calculations with the same data, I mean slightly different data, sorry, and they have ended up with another animal, which is the Loch Ness Monster, completely different. And therefore, if you believe that they are right, the conclusion is completely different. Everybody has been screwed up by the globalization of the last 30 years, except the 1%. There is no such thing as, you know, part of the middle class has also benefited from globalization. And of course, if you believe that we should use data in the way they have been used by Branko-Milanovic, you will end up with a certain type of macro policy, a public policy. While if you believe that the second group of economists is right, then you will end up with completely different public policy, and you will say, well, we definitely have to redistribute wealth from the richest to the wealthiest to the poorest. Next slide. So also a number of very technical questions, but I think they are key. There are debates about should we use the national income or the GDP. So at first glance you would say, well, that's a Byzantine problem. Actually, it's not, because GDP is based on the idea that investment, while the national income category is based on the idea that savings feed investment. And so you see that behind this apparently innocuous methodological debate, there is a huge political question, which is, should we favor the wealthiest who can accumulate wealth thanks to our labor, or should we favor those who work and create value? Another point is capital labor elasticity of substitution positive, bigger than 1, smaller than 1? The truth is must probably between 0 and 1, but this also has a huge consequence in terms of public policy. If you believe that it's bigger than 1, you will say, it's very easy to substitute capital to labor, and therefore labor should just adjust to machineries, AI, and all this. And therefore you will say, you have no alternative, but you have to just adapt to the situation, because otherwise we will replace you by machines, which is not true, actually, if you understand that capital labor elasticity of substitution is below 1. Third, does capital exist? The answer is no. This is an old debate from the 70s, the Cambridge controversy. And if you understand it, you will understand that we definitely need to understand our economy as being based on several entities, industrial capital, financial capital, social capital, etc., etc. The capital as such does not exist.
Gaël, sorry, I need to rush you up because we run out of the time, so could you...
Okay, can you give me just 1 minute to conclude?
Yes, please.
So if you can just go to the last slide, not the one before the last. There are a number of alternatives to these very wrong models, which are based essentially on the assumption of stock flow consistency. That is, you say, well, we know that an economy is not at equilibrium. We know that the dynamics is not linear, and we should just take care of the fact that stocks today are just the output of the dynamics of the trajectories in the past. If you keep all this in mind, and if you base your model on material flow analysis, that is, you say, well, energy matters, matter matters, money matters, then you can end up with much better models. We are constructing them today at Georgetown University with a number of other colleagues from the entire planet, and I hope that they one day will replace the very bad models that are used today in order to foster very wrong public policies. Thank you.
A big hand for you, Gaël. I think that this critical thinking about economics should be taught to all kids, boys and girls, just after they've learned to read and write. So best success to your teaching endeavors. But let's move, because of the time limits, and our next speaker, Valentina Bosetti, professor from Bocconi University, please.
Okay, I want first of all to thank the organizer. This is possibly the most rock concert type conference I've ever been, so that's why we academics are kind of shaky, because we're not used to this. Second, I want to sort of build on what has been said in the previous presentation and try to be a little more optimistic. I trained as an environmental scientist. Then I thought I would not matter in the world, so I trained as an economist. Then I realized economists would never accept me, so I did a PhD in mathematics, so now they can accept me. And I'm a modeler. So what I build are models, and I don't care, and I don't have a part, and I'm okay with many economics models. I take whatever works with other components, though I'm not married to any, by constitution, I'm not married to any discipline, and so I don't hate economics. I think economics has very good things to teach us. So what are these models that I've been working on, and actually are there since the 70s, and so much work has come out of these models and then been known because it's part of the IPCC. I guess all of you know what the IPCC is. Then the working group 3 leads with mitigations. With mitigation, the models in working group 3s are not climate models. Those are economic models with additional components. The beauty of these models is that they are called integrated assessment models. Within this name, you have so many different types, from general equilibrium to partial equilibrium, to system dynamics model, to simulation models, to nonlinear models. Everything goes. Because the problem is important. It's not a single model that we should marry, but it's the best model for the specific problem that I have at hand. And the thing that we've done as a discipline is to start to work with many models, many groups, and then sit together and say, okay, I have this assumption, you have this different assumption. Let's try to mimic the same problem, and let's debate about the differences in our results. That's the way we've built a community, which is the community I'm part of, and the results of which you see in the IPCC. So I want to tell you 3 things about this community. The first, I want to say a few more things about these models. The second, I want to show you some of the results that come out of this model. And the third is a surprise. So what these models are, otherwise you sleep. What these models are, some of them, the fact that they are integrated means that they, together with the economic activities, they also model the consequences for the environment. It could be the water, the oceans, it could be the air, the atmosphere, it could be the land and the biosphere, or it could be biodiversity. The idea is that these various elements are brought together in the same system, by a group of people that work together. And the idea is that the feedbacks may go in both directions. So economic activities might have effect on the environment, but the truth is also for the opposite direction. So we want to understand what a changed environment might imply for our productivity, labor productivity, capital productivity, infrastructure reliability, etc. So these models were born in the 70s, and then for a long time they were mostly funded in parts of Europe and the US. But then, more recently, Europe has really been pushing a lot of money into the creation of these models, with the second important ancillary benefit, pushing also for our community to involve national modeling teams. Why? Because a government likes to have a model that has been built by their own people. It seems crazy, but the same thing is happening for climate science models. Each country wants to have their own. They don't want to be told what is going to happen to the climate by US models or by European models. Each country wants to have their own. So, yeah, those are not my slides. My slides are only, yes, these are my slides. So, but it's okay. I mean, you can enjoy reading both. So it's a very beautiful graphic, but I didn't do that. So what are the, so first of all, I want us to be proud of the fact that Europe has really been funding this community, these models, that has then spread across the planet and really created a community that is now a global community. The second is that the results coming from this model have really been meaningful for policy making. An example is here. What you see in this IPCC figure is something as important as the time we should reach net zero emission, okay, to be able to reach a specific climate goal. For example, if you move to the left of the graph, you have more stringent climate goal. If you move to the right, you have less stringent climate goals. Now, who's producing those scenarios? Many, many scenarios that are used to define the timing of net zero are these models. Okay, so models that incorporate the economy, our activities, our productivity, what we produce, and the emissions that those activities produce, and that also model how we can change economic activities, how we can change the way we produce energy to reduce our emissions. The second set of results they produce is these beautiful rainbow graphs where we can see or imagine future way our energy system might work if we have different climate objectives in mind. So, to the comment made before that, forecasts tend to be wrong when you actually get to the time for when the forecast was made, I want to tell you this. It's very hard to be a modeler and project for 2030, 2050. Okay, you can be wrong in so many ways. But the point is that by producing these graphs, you start to ask yourself a question. A big important question we realized was, a big important problem we realized was that by postponing mitigation and, for example, believing that we would do more negative emissions later, we were putting at risk the biodiversity and the forests of the planet. So some of the trade-offs can only appear if you do runs. Maybe they are wrong, but still they might show you a trade-off that is there and real and important to take into account in your policy making. So what was the third thing that I wanted to tell you? Models are not just important because of the results they produce. Sometimes these results are wrong, as I said. The importance of models is that when you start to work together, economists, with people expert in air pollution, with people that are expert in biodiversity, you start to create a new language that is the language that you need to create a narrative, a story. The story is as important as the results because the story helps you explain the civil society, the policymakers, what are the problems. And the narrative can only come out from this very interdisciplinary discourse. And I think that's the most beautiful part of this. That's why I would not support also the rage against, what was his name, Bill Nordhaus. Why is everybody so upset? He's the first economy who cared. He got the damage function completely wrong. He actually is very unfair to show the 2013 paper because he has papers that came out many, many years. And the 2023, for example, paper is a completely different story. But he tried to speak with climatologists. He's the first economist who sat down with climatologists and tried to think, okay, can we do something about that? He maybe, it certainly did come out with wrong metric at the beginning. But the problem is that policymakers want to have a single damage function and that's going to be hit. How can you believe that there is a model that will produce numbers that are actually exact Models are there to look at the future, to study, to explore, and ask questions. They're not there to give you the thing. So his answer was wrong. Too bad. He started to ask the right questions, and I think that's important, and that should be recognized. With that, I conclude. Thank you.
A big thank you for Valentina for making it very clear, but not easier. And economics always aren't that, but that helps us to move on the path. Last but not least, Robert Costanza, professor from University College London. The floor is yours. A great, grand, knowledge person in environmental, social, and economics field. So we are very happy and pleased to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Sirpa, and thank you to the organizers. And this is an amazing gathering. It's been called in a previous session the Woodstock of Beyond Growth. So I'm not an economist by training. My background is in systems ecology, looking at the whole system. But during my PhD, they wanted me to take a language, and I convinced them to let me take economics instead. So I took economics as a foreign language. And I think I got enough of it to get inoculated, but not quite enough to get the full disease. So where are we? I had some slides. Sorry?
Were they the ones with the beautiful graphics?
No. No? Okay. Oh, here we go. Okay. Great. So, what comes beyond growth? I think I would argue that it's sustainable well-being. That's really what we're after. And how do we create that sustainable well-being? I think it requires these three basic elements. First of all, we have to have an adequate vision of how the world is, our scientific understanding. We heard about the planetary boundaries work. There's been a lot of work recently in human psychology, what actually does contribute to human well-being. I think we're learning a lot more about how the world actually does work, our scientific understanding. I think it needs to be much more integrated, though, to help us understand how this whole complex, interdependent system functions. But beyond that, I think we also need to have an adequate vision of how we would like the world to be. What are our goals for the future? And I think we need to build a truly shared and broadly shared consensus on those shared goals. And I think that's one of the missing elements here. I think we all in this room, I think, share some of the goals about what sustainable well-being is. But I think the challenge is, how do we broaden that vision? How do we bring the rest of, or at least 30% of the planet, which is said to be the tipping point, to allow these changes to happen? How do we bring them on board? I think one way to do that is to elaborate what that world would look like. What kind of world would that be? What would it be like to live in that world? Why would it be better than the world, and much, much better than the world that we have now, or in the world that we're headed toward? This session, though, is about modeling. What sort of tools and analysis do we need in order to achieve those goals? And I think we need much more systems thinking and modeling, because we do live in a complex adaptive system, as we've heard from many previous speakers. And that's the kinds of approach I think that we need. And the conventional economic models are not looking at the whole system. And finally, I think we need implementation strategies that are based on new kinds of institutions that can really deal with the commons, our common assets, and not just our private assets. And I'll argue. including things like common asset trust, which I'll talk a little bit about if we have time. But I also think we're going to need societal therapy, because I think our fundamental problem is that we're addicted to the current system. We're locked into this system that we have now. And we've been saying the same things that we've heard in this room, for decades now. Well, why haven't we made more progress? And so it's clear that simply confronting addicts with their problem and the solutions is often counterproductive. We need a more nuanced and a more positive kind of therapy, which I'll talk a little bit about if we get to that in the end. Before we start talking about models, I'll just remind you of this famous quote: that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. Some models are more wrong than others. That's true. But all models are wrong, even the models that we have in our heads, the way we think about the world. They're at least incomplete, and they're just abstract and incomplete representations of a very complex reality. So we have to approach this all with a lot more humility often than we tend to, and recognize the limitations of any abstract representation of reality. But also look for those representations that are useful, the ones that really do help us to achieve our shared goals that we've articulated. Another way of saying this is the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. We confuse the model with reality. We confuse the map with the territory. We get so married to our models or our ways of thinking of the world and our worldviews that we can't differentiate them from the more complex reality. This is a little more complicated, but one of my first interactions with economists was reading this paper by Herman Daly back in 1968. He wrote a very elegant paper titled, On Economics as a Life Science. And I think that's part of the problem, that economics should be a life science, not physics and chemistry, but one that looks at the whole planet and the complex interactions among the different parts. This diagram just shows the sort of conventional economic approach to modeling the market economy, sort of an input-output model at the center. But what Herman said that, well, we need to expand those boundaries out to the boundaries of the planet and say, the economy really is everything on the planet, because it's all interconnected. It all contributes to our well-being in some way or another. So that was an early attempt to begin to create this much more integrated approach to modeling that planet. But just to go back a little bit, what's the current vision or model of the macroeconomy? This is a simple caricature of that, which shows the sort of conventional, factors of production: land, labor, and capital. But assuming that these factors are infinitely substitutable, and they come together in the economic production process and produce GDP, goods and services, marketed goods and services. These are things that occur in the private market or exchange for money. Then they're either consumed or reinvested to make more capital to go into the future. And that our utility or welfare is mainly, if not solely, a function of how much we consume. Did I get water? Okay, we know this model's wrong. How useful is it? Well, it's got some very serious underlying premises. That more is always better, and that there's nothing in this model that would prevent it from growing forever. So this idea of infinite economic growth has sort of underlined a lot of the economic policies built on this sort of simplified vision of how the economy works. It also implies that private property is really the best way to go, because we're talking about goods and services that are private kinds of goods and services, privatizable, non-rival and excludable. And so why would you not try to privatize everything? And nature is really a sideshow in this model because, we can substitute labor and capital for natural resources and the environment and continue to grow the economy indefinitely. Okay, so what's a better model for the new world, for the Anthropocene that we've heard about before, for the full world that we now live in? We have to recognize that we live in a materially closed Earth system. Everything has to go somewhere. We cannot have, material growth of the economic subsystem on a finite planet indefinitely. That's just not going to happen. It has to recognize that these four basic types of assets, the conventional built capital, individual people, human capital, our interactions with each other, our communities, our governance, our institutions, our social capital, and our natural capital, everything else in the world that we didn't have to produce, are all required to produce conventional goods and services, but also to produce a whole range of other inputs and contributions to human well-being that are not marketed and should not be marketed. And that these are not substitutable assets, or at least not very far. So they're all required in some more balanced way in order to produce these services optimally. So how do we model this system in more quantitative ways, like the integrated assessment models that Valentina was talking about? Well, there's a range, there's a whole spectrum of different kinds of models of the economy that have been done so far. This is a plot from a paper that Dan O'Neill, who you heard from yesterday, and his co-author produced. And they've done a survey, an assessment of all of the ecological macroeconomic models that are out there. The ones that do try to incorporate not just the market economy, but the rest of the system into this. And they fall into a couple of categories. Some are the sort of expanded input-output models, some that include physical inputs and outputs. But I think the ones I want to emphasize are the systems dynamics models, the ones that actually do look at the way stocks and flows in the system change over time, and how we understand the complex feedbacks in those systems and how they affect all of the things that are important to us, including our sustainable well-being. Now, who's read this book, The Limits to Growth, in this audience? That's a pretty good fraction. It came out in 1972. I think it sold 10 million or more copies. So who would have thought that a book about a systems dynamics model of the planet, would sell that many copies? But this is actually what it looks like if you break it down into this Stella sort of simulation modeling language. So it includes, a range of different variables, I think on the order of 40 or so. But it also looks at how those things change over time. And they were quite ambitious in trying to build a model that started in 1900 and ran all the way through 2100, 2 centuries. Like, who had ever done that before in 1972? Nobody was even close to producing that kind of integrated, dynamic assessment of how this global system worked. They were way out there in front of everyone else. Of course, it was lambasted, particularly by the economics profession, because it didn't have prices. They were predicting a collapse. They were not showing that the economy could grow forever, essentially. So it must have been wrong. In fact, these are the comparison between the projections of that model and what actually happened. So it made projections in 1972 out to 2100, and it was predicting that in about 2030 this is the business as usual scenario. The other important thing about this is that this was not the only scenario that they produced. They produced a whole range of scenarios, including ones that showed how we could stabilize the system, how we could create a steady state economy, and the kinds of changes that we could have made back much earlier, that would have gotten us to a place of sustainable well-being, about now. So to carry on with that tradition, This is the 50th anniversary plus one of the limits to growth model by the Club of Rome. And for the 50th anniversary, this model was not just updated, but sort of recreated and expanded and built on to create this new model, which you can download and take a look at and play with on your on your laptops going forward. So that tradition goes on. Some of the differences in the new version are that they included well-being explicitly as a variable in the model, and they included a whole range of other factors. Again, this is not a complete picture of everything that's going on in the world, but that is the essential art of modeling. How do you produce a representation, an abstract representation of the system that is useful? That's useful in terms of trying to understand this complex system, trying to make projections into the future about how things might occur. And to do that, it gets complicated, but not so complicated that you can't begin to understand that, particularly if you can go in and play with the model yourself. One other model that I'll mention is this one by Peter Victor and Tim Jackson is actually working on a newer version of this what's called the low grow model, and this was a model of the Canadian economy, which was explicitly built sort of as a macroeconomic model, or as close to that as possible, but including many of the other factors that were necessary. And they were able to show that, if you just shut off GDP, that you could produce a no-growth disaster. But with the appropriate policy changes, you could also produce a low or no-growth version of the Canadian economy that could go off into steady state. So it's essentially an existence proof that you do not need, even in a complex economy like Canada, you don't have to have GDP growth to have a viable economic system that produces all of the benefits that we've been talking about. So, just remind you, though, that all models are wrong. But I think some of these systems dynamics kinds of models, ones that can actually incorporate the complexity of the whole system, and we're certainly getting much better at doing that as we learn more about how that system functions, and as we have much better data going forward about how it works, we can begin to create models that really are useful to help us get to our goal, our final goal of a sustainable well-being future. What sort of indicators do we need to attach to these models? Because I think that's the other connection, especially with this conference, that these models can be connected with different indicators of well-being. And I think one of the reasons that GDP has been so resilient to change is that it has this underlying system of national accounts, behind it. What we need, I think, going forward is a much more comprehensive system dynamics model to complement and replace that static system of accounts, one that has the appropriate set of indicators built into it, so that we can look at not only how those things changed in the past, where they are in the future, but how they might change, where they are in the present, but also how they might change into the future under different policy constraints. We also need, I think we're at the point now, as we've said in one of our previous sessions, that there's been enough experimentation with different indicators of well-being and sustainability that we can now get to the point of building a broad consensus on what those appropriate indicators are. So I think that's the challenge that we're facing at the moment, and I think connecting that with a better system dynamics understanding of the system will also help. We can also employ a much broader range of data sources than we have ever in the past, and I think the integrated assessment models have started to do that. But we don't have to be stuck with the kinds of data that we know how to collect. What we really should do is start to figure out what do we want to measure and figure out ways that we might be able to go forward and to measure that. So, but what's holding us back, to create this sustainable well-being economy? What do we have to do? And I would argue that fundamentally we have to break our addiction to this growth at all costs economic paradigm, to fossil fuels, to overconsumption in high-income countries, to all of the things that are that are reinforcing in the system, and that are hard to break out of. We've been, as I said, making these same assessments and proposing the same solutions for decades, but we haven't made much progress in overcoming this addiction. That means it's going to take some kind of therapy, and it turns out that what works at the individual scale to overcome addictions is not confronting addicts with their problems. That's often counterproductive. But one therapy that works is based on establishing the life goals of the individual. What kind of life do they want to achieve? And using that to help motivate the difficult changes that are necessary to overcome addictions. And I think it's the same process that we could use at the societal scale. How do we create that shared vision of where we all want to go? I don't think we've spent enough time and effort, trying to do that. And I think there are some unique challenges to doing that, but there are also some unique opportunities out there. With the internet, the ability to communicate with everyone on Earth, the Sustainable Development Goals are clearly a step in that direction of creating a global shared vision. But I think we could do much more than that. And ultimately, I think it's going to take a movement in order to implement that vision. Once we have that shared vision, once it becomes clear enough, and that's the kind of world that we want, then I think that can help to motivate the difficult political changes to overcome, the fossil fuel lobby, to overcome many of the kinds of lock-in addictions that we have in society today.
Bob, I hate
I'm
to
done. Yeah.
interrupt you, but could you please wrap in 1 minute?
This is my last slide. I'll just put up some recent books that go into more detail on all of this. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Bob, for your presentation. And one of the, out of the many important messages what you had is that learn to measure what you want, and I would add there what you do not want, not only what you've used to measure and what is available and easy. And then, of course, one of my favorites is the system thinking and modeling, and another thing that everybody should learn after adding and minus in mathematics in school. Once again, a great thank to our panelists, and one question that I would like to ask you a quick comment, because I think that we all here can agree that the GDP is not a good measure. It is actually a very perversive measure if we look what it actually delivers to us as natural capital and human well-being. We can agree that there's a lot of data, right, already, and measurements. The only point is how to get them on board, to agree how to harmonize, standardize them. And we can agree that there's quite a rush to do that. We can't wait 100 years. It's more or less like five years that we have the time. And we agree that we need to change the economic modeling, like Gaël very well and the rest of you have shown. So my last question for all of you would be, what is then the role of universities, science institutions, and then the politics? So what do you think that the science, the knowledge, people like you could and should do to engage the civil society and politicians? because I can't do a remodeling of any kind. And then what are your expectations to us politicians? What needs to happen in regulatory level to facilitate this process? And Anne, would you like to start?
Yes, I've got mine here. So I think it's really important. I think I can deal with the last part of your question, which is what is the role for politicians? And I think the role for politicians on our side of the spectrum, so to speak, is to understand our power. You know, and also think about it as power, because we have power, but it's unused. You know, Wall Street knows how to use public infrastructure. We don't know how to say, sorry, these are the terms and conditions. I personally wasn't against the bailout of the banks in 2008-9. What I was against was that it was done unconditionally, and the politicians have to lose their or, if you like, the way in which they sort of genuflect to these financial institutions and say, sorry, no, you know, we want terms and conditions for bailouts. If you want to use our assets, if you want to use our resources, public resources, taxpayer-backed resources, these are the terms and conditions. So we just like our politicians to have a bit more spine or backbone, if you like, when it comes to dealing with them.
Thank you. And Gaël, what would be your answer?
So my answer would be twofold. First, regarding universities, I would say what we need today is not a university, but a pluriversity. That is a place where we really can have an open discussion about alternatives. So I definitely agree that Bill Nordhaus has played a big role, and that's absolutely beautiful. But we definitely also need today to have other voices showing that, well, the situation might be much more serious than he believed during years. So that would be the role of a pluriversity as opposed to a university, which is an inheritance from the Middle Age. And regarding politicians, I would go exactly in the same direction of Anne. So let me just give you an example. If you have understood as a politician that money is non-neutral and that there is money creation, then you can think in the European system, why is the European Central Bank independent from the political power? So as a politician, you should question that and say, well, maybe this was a mistake. You know, the sacrosanct independence of the central bank makes no sense once we understand that money has an impact on fiscal policy and vice versa. And then you could also say, why not put into practice a QE for people or a quantitative easing for green investments, for a Green New Deal at the European level? Then you might even go as far as saying, couldn't we cancel the public debts which is held at the balance sheet of the ECB? Or even you could say, could the ECB purchase some fossil fuel assets on the balance sheet of commercial banks and play the role of the bad bank? Because we know that sooner or later, people will suggest to create bad banks that will do exactly the same job as they did in 2009, that is to buy fossil fuel assets in order to save our commercial banks from a disaster. And then these are the big questions that politicians could ask once they really have understood that money matters, matter matters, energy matters.
Thank you, Gaël. And then to Valentina, what is your advice?
So I started teaching climate change economics 10 years ago, and I had 10 students. I am in a mainstream economics university. Now I have 100 plus, and I have multiple courses. And so I'm very optimistic about the new generation. I'm very pessimistic about the older generation. Last 3 years I experienced the private sector, and I was, I was shocked by the level of knowledge that young engineers have in a big energy company. Really, they know everything about climate change. They think about infrastructure by thinking ahead and looking at climate projections. So that wasn't the problem. The problem is all the, public people working in the public sector, policymakers, etc. I come from Italy, they are very old. So they didn't learn any of this at school. They have no idea, zero. So I would talk about the 2-degree target. They have no idea of, I mean, they say 2-degree target because it's written, but they have no idea what that means, 2%, 2, minus 2 of what. So complete ignorance, and that, I don't know how to change that. In a country with very old people in power, that the only way is that younger people vote them down, but in my country they don't.
There, all the young people and other activists, you hear it. Plus then, join the parties, the one that is closest to you, or then some of the conservative parties. You know, if all these 10,000 people that have been attending this conference would recruit 5 of their friends, and then all over our member states would take over the conservative parties. Wow, would I have friends? And actually the political structure isn't that powerful and big when it comes to membership. And if people really would take that hardship to come in to battle and debate and be voting on party congresses about the programs and prime ministers and with whom you go to government or whatever, that makes the trick. So please. Then, last but not least, Robert, back to you and your comments.
Well, I think universities have traditionally, been the source of social change, and I think it can happen again. But I think we also need to change the way we're handling teaching in universities. That we need much more engaged, education, much more sort of problem-focused. And I think if we could have, students and politicians and business leaders working together to solve problems, rather than simply lecturing at students and telling them what we already know, how do we get them in the classroom, working together with other stakeholders to discover new solutions and new ways to go. And also to change the age and gender dynamics in the classroom and the power dynamic. So this whole idea of learning by doing and problem-based learning, I think we could do a lot more with that to push this agenda forward. And it also, I think, is going to take a movement. It's going to take political change at some level, and that has to be driven by this vision. What does this world look like? And make it clear that we're not talking about people sacrificing, to get to this world. We're talking about an improvement in people's quality of life, and in many, many ways. And I think the psychological research sort of backs that up quite clearly. But that is not known to most people. Most people think they have to continue to consume, and that's the only path to happiness. But it's obviously not.
Thank you, Robert. I see different kind of international hand signs from the organizers, so unfortunately we do not have time for questions from the audience, but it's totally my fault, not the panel and not the organizers, so I take it. And very briefly, 1,000 thanks to our wonderful panelists and wonderful audience. You made it. Thank you.